Well, this past week, I found myself sitting in a peach orchard in Pennsylvania, pondering just how very close we came to singing Dixie before all of our football games on Sunday afternoons instead of the Star-Spangled Banner. Because that peach orchard was the site of one man's foolish decisions that nearly caused the United States of America to be forever divided. Now, most peach orchards don't carry that sort of significance, obviously, but this one happens to be in the middle of the battlefield at Gettysburg. And I know that some of you may not be history nerds and history buffs, but the lessons we learn from looking back are hard to deny. Gettysburg is not only the most famous Civil War battle, but it was also a major turning point in the war. Leading up to it, the South, the Graycoats, they had just kind of run wild. They had strung victory after victory together. But at Gettysburg, those blue coat-wearing Northerners finally proved that the South was not invincible. And right in the middle of that pivotal moment in our nation's history was a man by the name of Daniel Sickles. On the second day of fighting at Gettysburg, July 2nd, 1862, Sickles found himself perched atop a little hill at the far south end of the battlefield known as Little Round Top. Now, for anyone familiar with the Battle of Gettysburg, you're probably familiar with the names Big Round Top and Little Round Top. And if you're not familiar with those names, they are what they sound like they are. They are two little hills on the southern end of the battlefield, and both of those hills and positions provided an outstanding vantage point, and it provided outstanding advantages to anyone who found themselves standing on top of those hills. They were both elevated above the relatively flat and open fields below them, and they both allowed for whoever was on top to see everything that was going on in front of them and to shoot down on the enemy. And in fact, Little Round Top had actually just been timbered months prior, which meant that it was an ideal and perfect position for cannons to be placed since there were no trees to obstruct the views or to obstruct the firing lanes. Now, those hills were where Sickles was posted, and they were also not just, an important strategic position because they were elevated and you could see well, but they were on the far left end of the Northern Army's line, which meant that he didn't just have a good vantage point, but that he was the man on the end of the line, and if he was run off of those hills, if he could not repulse the attacks from the south, if he could not hold his ground, then the North would simply run him off of the hills and run right down the line and send the North packing. So it was desperately important that he figured out a way to keep that sort of thing from happening. And the commander of the Northern Army, General Meade, he knew that the commander of the Southern Army, Robert E. Lee, would probably try to do exactly that, which is why Meade put Sickles and 10,000 men under his command on those hills. And so the Bluecoats, they held the advantage in terms of position, but they had managed to lose from the high ground before. The Graycoats had outflanked and outmaneuvered the North at every turn at this point in the war. But if the Union could manage to hold their ground but what seemed to be an invincible army of Southerners at this point, then the men responsible for such a victory, they would become heroes. And Daniel Sickles found himself positioned to become one of those heroes. As a testament to how strong this position that Sickles found himself in is when Lee gave the orders to his commanders to attack those hills, several of his commanders pushed back and they said, "That's a suicide mission. There's no way we can take those hills. The position is too strong, they're too entrenched, they're too well set up. There is just no way it can happen." But Lee was determined that his men could do it, and he was determined to see those hills turn from blue to gray. But his determination did not change the fact that Sickles held an enormous advantage by the ground he occupied. And under Meade's leadership, the plan was simply to hold that ground and wait for the South to come to them. But as the South prepared for their attack, Daniel Sickles began to formulate a plan of his own. He looked out at the fields below him, and he looked out in this kind of flat, open area, and he saw this little knoll where this peach orchard laid. Now, that orchard was several hundred yards out beyond the bottom of the hill that he was currently standing on, which meant it was several hundred yards closer to the enemy lines, and it was several hundred yards out in front of the rest of his own army that was stationed to his right. But despite all of those facts, Sickles just liked the way it looked for some reason. It looked like a good place to be to him. And so he wrote up a note and sent a message off to General Meade to request permission to move his 10,000 men off of that ideal position on Little Round Top forward through the fields and into that peach orchard. Now, obviously, when General Meade reads that message, he's going to go, no, you may not do that. That is absurd. But Sickles had ordered his letter just so that it left a lot up for interpretation. See, all he asked was if he could move his men to a more advantageous position, which left a lot up for interpretation. And so whether General Meade did not have time to ask clarifying questions or he didn't care to, he essentially told Sickles, you just do what you think is best, which is not a completely absurd thing to do. Because Meade knew that Sickles knew the plan was for him to stay on those hilltops on the left end of the line and hold that ground. Meade knew that Sickles knew that. And he thought, surely this guy's got 10,000 men under his command. He's not an unreasonable guy. He's not an idiot. So he's not going to do anything crazy. And so he says, you do as you see fit. And Sickles take that as permission to do what he thought he should do. And so he marched his 10,000 men off of that hill, down through the wheat field, and out into the peach orchard toward the enemy. And when Meade looked to his left, and he saw 10,000 men who were supposed to be protecting the far left end of his line, now standing out in the middle of the field, out in the middle of this peach orchard, he immediately rode out to have a word with the man responsible. And when he got to Sickles, it was all Meade could do to keep from calling him a moron to his face. But there was no reason for him to be out in the middle of this peach orchard, and yet there he was. And so he made his displeasure clear, and Sickles said, well, if I've displeased you, then I'll just move back. And Meade said, it's too late. It's too late because the South is already advancing, and because you have now moved several hundred yards towards them, they're nearly upon you. You do not have time to retreat. You're stuck. And so with that, Meade rode back to command of the rest of the 80,000 troops that were on the line, and Sickles was left to deal with the results of his not just bad idea, but nearly catastrophic mistake. Not just for him, but for almost the entire nation. Because now Sickles was so far out of place that not only was he in danger, but the entire left-hand side of the Union army, the Union line, was now just open for attack, in those hills that were so important and such a great position were now completely up for grabs for anybody who wanted them. Now, fortunately, the north, a man noticed that those hills were completely undefended, and he sent out word saying, hey, we got to have some help over here. And another man by the name of Strong Vincent answered the call to fill the gaping hole that was left by Sickles on those hilltops. And it was only because of the incredible bravery and wisdom and response of a man like Strong Vincent that those hills were saved and remained under blue control. But had Vincent not acted with incredible courage and wisdom, and he had not positioned his man, he had a little over 1,000 men to replace 10,000 men, and he replaced them and he held the ground. But had he not done that, the Battle of Gettysburg may have gone very differently, and it may have been won by the South, leading to the South winning the war, had Vincent not stepped up. However, just because Vincent stepped up and filled that hole, and that disaster was narrowly avoided, Sickles and his men, they paid really, really dearly for his unwise and foolish actions. Sickles himself, he had his leg blown off by a cannon. And thousands of men died in that peach orchard and in the wheat field behind it. In fact, those grounds became one of the bloodiest places on the entire battlefield at Gettysburg. And the area below Little Round Top became the scene of a slaughter, where men lay dying and wounded for days. And many remember Daniel Sickles as the man who nearly cost the North a victory at Gettysburg and nearly cost the North the war. And Sickles was perfectly positioned at the beginning of the day on top of Little Round Top to deal a decisive blow to the enemy, and yet he squandered it. And he nearly cost them the war because of his foolishness. And our nation would have been forever altered had Strong Vincent not stepped in and saved the day. However, Sickles' plan may have been incredibly foolish, it may have been dumb, but it was not cowardly. Sickles knew that this was a decisive moment. He knew that this was a decisive battle, and he knew that he was in position to make a difference in the fight. And he decided that he was going to go forward and he was going to fight fiercely. In fact, Sickles was later awarded the Medal of Honor for the fighting that day. Because after he had his leg blown off, he was in the wheat field still encouraging his men and trying to rally his men even with his leg blown off. He was not a coward. However, just because he didn't lack nerve or gumption or bravery, he certainly did lack other attributes like wisdom and discernment and the ability to stay in step and work in concert with what General Meade was planning for the battlefield of the whole. And although he was plenty courageous, the presence of courage does not negate the need for wisdom and for discernment and to work in concert with the bigger picture. And those principles extend far beyond just some Civil War battlefield. We have talked for the last 3 weeks about how God providentially positions us and orchestrates our lives so that we have got an opportunity to make a difference. But while it is true that He is working behind the scenes to accomplish His purposes in ways that go completely unseen to us, there are moments where we have these moments of clarity and we realize that, oh wow, I've got a chance here. God has set me up for just such a moment of this, and I've got a chance to make a big difference because of where God has set me at this moment. And when you come into spots like that, where that realization and that clarity happens, like it did for Sickles on Little Round Top, like it does for Esther in chapter 4 that we talked about last week, we have to not only summon our courage, like Esther does, but also have to act and move with wisdom. Because courage also needs wisdom. Having the courage to say, if I perish, I perish, is something that we have a really hard time doing. But even if we're able to do that, and we have the courage to rise to the moment, we have to be wise in order to seize the moment that God has orchestrated for us. We have to be discerning in how we move and act after that. And we have to do so in a way that is in concert with what the unseen hand of God is continuing to do. Or else, we will find ourselves in the middle of a peach orchard when we ought to be on the hilltops. And if we repeat the foolishness of Sickles in our own lives, we're going to squander the opportunities God creates for us, and we are going to cause ourselves and very likely the people around us a whole lot more hardship and difficulty and heartache and suffering than is necessary. So we're going to pick up Esther's story in chapter 5, and we're going to see if she is courageous or she is courageous and wise. And by seeing how she deals with this, we're going to learn something about how we can also work in concert with the finger of God. And that leads us to this principle. To make a difference for God, our courage must work hand in hand with God's wisdom. To make a difference for God, if we want to see change happen, if we want to seize the opportunities He sets up for us, then our courage has got to work hand in hand with God's wisdom. Now, last week in chapter 4, we saw Esther have her moment, so to speak. We saw her go from waiting on God to realizing that her moment had come. And Mordecai, when he discovers Haman's plot to wipe out the Jews, he goes to Esther and he helps her see that the finger of God has been quietly and invisibly to her, writing her story and positioning her for just such a moment as this. But Esther doesn't just realize that the moment has come. She also finds the courage to say, I'm going to do something about it. She says, if I perish, I perish. In other words, God has orchestrated this moment. He has put me in this spot for this exact time, and I am not going to stand by, and I am not going to watch it just happen without me doing anything, even if it cost me my life. And so she says, if I perish, I perish. I'm going to do something. And then the very last thing we read in chapter 4 is her first move is that she calls for a 3-day fast, which would have included prayer as well, not just for her, but for all of her people. Now, we don't know what Esther prayed about during those 3 days. But what we do know is at the end of those 3 days is where chapter 5 begins. And Esther is going to have to now do something. She is going to have to act. And she really has only got one option. She needs to speak with the king. But the problem is, if the king does not send for her, she has no choice but to go to the king. And that might sound simple, but it is not quite as simple as it sounds. Because even for the king's wife, even for the queen of Persia like Esther, to go before the king, her husband, uninvited, was a potentially lethal mistake. Because if you were not expected, and you just showed up before the king uninvited, and he did not extend the scepter to you, you could lose your life. Just that fast. For just showing up uninvited. It could all end in the blink of an eye. And Esther has to be thinking that this could all end so fast for her if the king just doesn't extend that scepter. It could all go up in flames in a moment. And I would imagine that this is probably the moment she was thinking about when she says, you know what, if I perish, I perish. because she knows that her life is going to be hanging in the balance and it can be taken from her in a moment if the king just doesn't reach out his hand and reach out the scepter. All of this orchestration by God and all of this positioning her to be seen and to win favor in the eyes of the king and all of his servants and become the queen, and all of this positioning for Mordecai to overhear these plans, all of this happening could all just vanish if the king doesn't reach out his hand. Here's how it plays out. Esther chapter 5, 1 and 2. On the third day, after the third day of prayer and fasting, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he has to decide whether he's going to extend that scepter or not. It says she won favor in his sight. He held out the scepter. Esther went and then approached, and she touched the top of that scepter. Now, that's a pretty easy little moment to gloss over, especially if you know the story. But again, this could have been a very fast, a very unceremonious, well, good grief, I can't say that word. Unceremonious, there it is. That's why I don't say big words. It could have been a very unceremonious end to all of this orchestration by God. It feels like her whole life's leading to this moment, and yet all that stands between her and death is the king doing this or not. That's it. And so when she goes forward and she touches that scepter, she has to take the biggest, deepest, fullest breath of her life and go, oh, okay. But here's the thing. Esther is doing this at this moment at great peril to herself, not even really for herself. At this moment, she is doing this. She is risking her life, putting it all on the line for her people. Because remember, the genocide says, hey, we're going to wipe out the Jews. That's the edict. That's what's been declared. And guess what? Nobody knows Esther's a Jew at this point. And so she is probably thinks, she's like, I'm safe. They're not coming after me. They don't know. She's not in danger at this point. Now, maybe she would have been found out. Maybe she wouldn't have. She'd managed to make it this far. And so she is doing this not really to save her own life so much, but to save the life of her people. And then secondly, she is taking this risk for what might seem like a completely hopeless cause. Completely hopeless. Because she knew that the law said that this new edict that the king had already signed to wipe out the Jews could not be repealed. Once the king put his stamp on it and said, that's what we're going to do, we're going to put this into law, we're going to put this into action, no one, including the king himself, could repeal that. And so it might seem that she's too late. Haman's plot is already in motion. The king has already signed off on it. What good is it going to do for her to go before the king now? No one can repeal it. No one can change it. No one can alter it. So what's the point? And yet, even knowing that it couldn't be repealed, even thinking probably in the back of her mind that she hasn't been found out, that she's not a Jew, she cares about her people, she cares about what God is asking her to do, and so she musters her courage, she prays, and she goes before the king, and by the grace of God and by the providence of God, the king smiled when he saw his wife, and he held out the scepter. That's a huge, huge hurdle for Esther to clear. But that is just the beginning. And she is nowhere near out of the woods yet, because the goal is not just to get an audience with the king. It's to do something about this evil plot that's in motion. And so now she's standing in front of the king, and she's lived through that, but she's got to try to find a way to expose Haman. She's got to try to find a way to come out with the fact that she's a Jew, and so we've got to save these people. They're her people. And how are you going to bring that up before the king? And then this happens in verse 3. It says, and the king said to her, unprompted, the king welcomes her, and then he says to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What's your request? It shall be given you, even to half of my kingdom. Well, isn't that convenient? Esther goes in thinking, oh my gosh, I don't know how I'm going to ask him for this. I don't know how I'm going to bring this up. And then the first thing he says is, what do you want? You can have anything you want. I'll give you half the empire. What's your request? You can have it, of course. And so it seems like a huge, big door has just opened wide to Esther, and so she has just got to walk through it, right? All she has to do is say, well, boy, do I ever have a request. You're going to want to hear this one, and then come out with it. Here's what she says, verse 4 of chapter 5. And Esther said, if it please the king, Let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king. What? What? She gets a wide open door. The king says, you can have anything you want. I'll give you half the kingdom. And she goes, honey, I think we need some quality time. It's been a while since we've had dinner. You want to come to dinner? Do you want to bring Haman too? You know, the bad guy can third wheel. Do you want to bring Haman? Are you kidding me? Esther's got a wide open door and she wants to have dinner. Is Esther losing her nerve? She chickening out in the big moment? She lose her gumption at the last second, the courage all of a sudden forsake her? Or was this a little bit of a strategic move? You see, Esther's got a bomb she wants to drop on the king. And when she drops that bomb, she wants Haman in the room. And she might not want everybody else in the room that could currently be in the room. And so even though it seemed like Esther had a great opportunity here, she has the wisdom and she has the discernment to know that this is not the time or place. This is not the moment. It's close, but this is not it. And so she delays. She says, why don't you come to dinner? Bring Haman with you. And so she spends the rest of the day preparing. And that night at dinner, while Esther and the king and the Haman are eating together, it seems like it all falls into place. While they're eating, the king, he asks his question again because he knows Esther didn't really want dinner. She wanted something else. And so he says, hey, what's your request? Anything you want, I'll give it to you. You can have whatever it is. I'll do for you whatever you want. I'll give to you whatever you want, up to half the kingdom. What would you like? And so with this second golden opportunity, Esther says this in verses 7 and 8. Then Esther answered, my wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. Now, Esther passing up the first opportunity, you can say, well, maybe, that's a strategic move because Haman wasn't in the room, but this seems like a mistake, doesn't it? This seems like a mistake. All the right people are in the room. And the king is in a great mood. He says, hey, remember what I said earlier? I meant that. What do you want? Anything. I'll grant it. Half the kingdom. And the best she comes up with is, well, can we do this again tomorrow? Would you like to come back to dinner again? Bring Haman too. Same thing. The three of us, we'll eat tomorrow. A nation is hanging in the balance. The Jewish people are on the chopping block. The hammer is getting ready to fall, and she says, no, not now. And she doesn't pull the trigger. And the text doesn't really explain why. But have you ever had those moments where everything looks right? It seems like everything's in place, and yet something just doesn't feel right. Something is off. Something is wrong. Something is out of place. You can't see it. You can't put your finger on it. But you just get this sense that it's not right. Apparently, Esther was having one of those moments. And whether that was the Holy Spirit whispering into her ear to just wait, or whether she's using her perceptive abilities to read the room and say, it's not the right moment. If I speak up now, it's not going to go well for me. For whatever reason it is, she wisely decides to just hold off for one more day. Even though everything looked like it was in place, just one more day. And in the course of that one more day, two very important things happen that would not have happened if she would have spoken up on that first night at dinner. After dinner, the three part ways, each in a different state of mind. Esther is dealing with the weight of the world on her shoulders. It is not lost on her that her people are hanging in the balance. She is not forgetting that. The king, he's got a full belly. He's had a great meal with his wife and his buddy Haman. But the king's got to be wondering a little bit at least what exactly it is that Esther's building up to and what she's going to ask. And Haman, well, Haman's as happy as can be. He's as pleased with himself as he could possibly be because he has earned an invitation not once but twice to dinner with just the king and the queen of the whole empire. And he is sure that he is earning these because he is such an awesome guy. Haman is convinced that I am such great company. I am so important. They love me so much. I am the man. And so they just keep inviting me to dinner. They can't get enough of me. And then, as Haman's telling this story to himself in his head, he begins his journey towards home, and something happens that threatens to ruin it all for him. Because as he's heading home, he passes by his arch nemesis, Mordecai. And true to form, Mordecai, once again, he doesn't tremble, he doesn't bow down, he doesn't pay the homage that Haman thinks is owed him, and it just burns Haman up. He's had a great day, but it just burns him up on the way home when he sees Mordecai being defiant and refusing to give him his due, what he thinks is his due anyway. And so Haman goes home with this kind of mixed bag of emotions, and he starts to gather some folks. He gathers his wife and some of his friends, and he starts to tell them about how great he is and his riches and his glories and his success and how he was invited to dinner and how he's going back again tomorrow night and all of these things. And then he gets to the end of just bloviating and going on and on and on about just how wonderful he is. And he says, but you know what? It's all for nothing. It's all for nothing. All of my success, all of my honor, all of my glories, because Mordecai won't bow down. Mordecai won't pay me my due. He won't pay me the homage I think I deserve. And so it's all for nothing. If that is not a grown man throwing a temper tantrum, I don't know what is. He is at the peak of his career. He's dining with the king and queen of the empire, and he goes home and he goes, Mordecai won't bow down. He's ruining my life. You've got to be kidding. It's pathetic. It's pathetic. There's one guy who won't do what he wants, and it's ruining his whole life. And so he tells his friends and his wife, he goes, you know, it's all great, and I'm all great, but Mordecai is really just tearing everything to pieces. And his wife and his friends, they don't go, dude, get a grip. They say, oh, it's okay. You know what you should do? And they offer this solution. Verse 14 of chapter 5, it says, then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made. It's about 75 feet. And in the morning, tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. What a lovely woman. He comes home and he goes, honey, there's this guy at work that's aggravating me. She goes, well, then hang him. Hang him. Just swing him from the gallows and then go have dinner. It'll be great. And he goes, you know what? That's such a good idea, love. I'm going to do that. Really, very special woman. But he loves the idea. He says, you know what, you're exactly right. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to prepare the gallows, and tomorrow I'm going to watch Mordecai swing from him, and then I'm going to go have a good meal. And so Haman is very pleased with himself. He lays down very happy, looking forward to the next day. But the king, back at the palace, he's having a little bit of a different experience, trying to get some sleep. Esther 6, verse 1 says this. It says, on that night, the king could not sleep. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. Now, this is the equivalent of the king trying to watch infomercials at 3 a.m. because he can't figure out how to, get some rest. However, apparently King Ahasuerus' TV was out, and so he had to settle for the book. And so he has this book of memorable deeds, just recorded things. Hey, we ought to remember this. This happened. This was important. And he has this guy reading it to him. He's trying to soothe his troubled mind. He's trying to drift off to sleep. And then he stumbles across something interesting. You remember all the way back in Esther chapter 2, right about the same time as Esther is becoming the new queen. Remember this event where the finger of God orchestrates for Mordecai to be in the right place at the right time to overhear this plot to attack the king by two of the king's eunuchs. And Mordecai overhears that plot, and then he takes that news to Esther, and he says, hey, these two guys have got some bad ideas, and they're coming after the king. You might want to warn them. And Esther goes to the king and goes, hey, Mordecai told me that this thing is happening, and the plot's uncovered, the king is saved, the schemers, they are hanged. And then there's this little throwaway line at the end of chapter 2. It says this, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Kind of a throwaway line. Kind of a, okay, great, whatever. Well, guess what story the king comes across as he's listening to this book of records when he can't sleep? And when that story is read back to him, he goes, oh yeah, Mordecai. Hey, did we ever do anything for that guy to kind of honor him and reward him and say, hey, thanks for saving my life? We ever do anything for him? The guy reading the book goes, no, we didn't do anything for him. And so the king goes, well, man, I'd like to do something for Mordecai. That's a pretty big deal, saving my life and all. And so the king goes, what should we do? What should we do? She goes, hey, is anybody else around that could maybe help me come up with a way to honor Mordecai? What would somebody want if they were, the king wants to honor them, what would they want? And the servants go, well, Haman actually just came in. Maybe ask him. And the king goes, great, bring him in, bring him in. Now, bear in mind, Haman has now come bouncing into the palace, just, skipping, happy as he can be, looking forward to saying, hey, we're going to hang Mordecai. And that's his whole thing. He's getting ready to go ask the king, hey, I want to hang Mordecai. And he's sure the king's going to go, yeah, of course, whatever you want. Because he's the king's, he's his buddy, he's his most trusted advisor. And so he's going to say, sure, whatever you want. And so he comes in fantasizing about Mordecai's death. And then the king says, hey, come here for a minute. This is what we read in verse 6 of Esther chapter 6. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, well, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? Haman cannot conceive of a world where he is not the center of the universe. He cannot conceive of it. He says, who would the king want to honor more than me? Of course he's talking about me. He's being kind of sly about it. He says, what would a great guy like yourself want? And Haman goes, well, I know exactly what I would want. And so Haman says, here's what I would want. And he responds to the king, and he says, I'd want to wear the king's robes. I'd want to wear royal robes, and I would want to be put on a horse, beautiful horse, and I would want to be paraded through the city with somebody proclaiming my glories and proclaiming that the king loves me and proclaiming that the king wants to honor me. That's what I would want. And the king goes, that's a great idea. Right on the money. And he says this, verses 10 and 11. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you've mentioned. Do it all. Don't leave anything out. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai, and he led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. That is one of the most satisfying turns of events in all of recorded history. Haman bounces into the palace thinking he's going to hang Mordecai, and a few hours later, he is dressing Mordecai in the royal robes. He is leading Mordecai on a horse through the city, and he is proclaiming, this is the man who the king wants to honor. That is perhaps the most beautiful humiliation of somebody there has ever been. He says, who would the king want to honor more than me? And he lays out his dreams, and then he makes all of his own dreams come true for Mordecai, the guy that he hates. And Haman's having a terrible day. I mean, truly. I can't help but smile and laugh every time I read this. I'm thinking that maybe Mordecai's got a smirk on his face as he's riding through the town on the horse, being, led and proclaimed Mordecai's glories and all of this, but Haman is not laughing. And so he gets through this harrowing experience for him, and he eventually goes home, and he's moaning and groaning about what has happened to him. And then even his wife and his wise men, who just the day before said, we'll just hang Mordecai, and then go have dinner, they say this to him. They say, if Mordecai, before whom you have already begun to fall, if he's of the Jewish people, you will not overcome. You're not going to overcome. You're not going to beat him. Surely you will fall before him. His wife and his friends tell him that. And he's thinking, golly, that's not what I wanted to hear. Are you kidding me? And so as he's trying to recover from that, the conversation is still going. Two guys come in and they say, hey, you got dinner with the king and queen, remember? And so they take him to dinner, and he's thinking, oh, finally, a little bit of relief and a bright spot in the middle of just a, terrible, no good, awful day. But as he's walking to go to dinner, Esther is back at the palace. She's preparing, and she is under pressure, the likes of which you and I can probably not imagine. She's been preparing all day for this moment. God has been preparing her for her whole life for this moment. And so they're eating dinner. They're enjoying their meal. Don't know what the conversation is like, but I would imagine it's tough for Esther to make small talk. And so the king speaks up. He makes his offer again. He says, whatever you want, half the kingdom, what is it? I know that you don't just want dinner. What would you like? You can have it. And Esther reads the room. The events of the last 24 hours, they set the stage for this moment. And this time it not just looks right to Esther, but it feels right. She's got a sense that this is the moment for which God has been positioning her. And so when the king's asked that question again, she finally tells him what's really on her mind. Esther chapter 7, verses 3 and 4. Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted me for my wish." Now the king at that moment has to be thinking, what is happening here? I offered you half the kingdom and what you want is your life? Who's threatening to kill you? She says, my life, let that be granted me for my wish. And my people for my request, not just her, but her people. She says, because for we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. I think the king was ready to hear a lot of things. I don't think he was ready to hear that. And when the king hears that, when he hears that Esther's saying, I'm just asking for my life and the life of my people, the king says, who would dare threaten it? Who would dare threaten the life of my queen? Who is trying to annihilate her and her people off the face of the earth? Who would dare do something like that? And Esther looks across the table and she says, Haman would do something like that. It's him. And the Bible says at that moment that Haman became terrified, not without good reason. Because all the way up to that very moment, when she looks him in the eye and she says, he would. Haman had no idea that he was in danger. The king had no idea what Haman had done. 3 seconds before that moment, Haman thought he was as safe as could be. And then in the blink of an eye, it all becomes clear. The king and Haman realize what's going on. Esther unveils the plot. And Haman has what has to be just the biggest moment of, oh no, there has ever been. The king, it says he's enraged. And so he storms out to go find some guys. He wants some guys to come in and grab Haman. And he's not sure what he wants to do with them, but he knows he wants to grab Haman. So he goes out to get some guys. And when the king walks out of the room, Haman makes it worse for himself. He digs an even deeper hole because it says that when the king went out of the room, it says that he was begging for his life before Queen Esther, and says he was falling on the couch where Esther was, begging for his life. And apparently when the king returned and he sees Haman falling on the couch where Esther was, begging for life, it looks to him like he is trying to assault the queen. And it says this, the king comes back in the room and it says, will he even assault the queen in my presence? In my own house? He comes back and he says, what are you doing? Now you're all over top of the queen on my house. It's in my house and you're falling all over the queen. You don't just want to kill her, but now you're attacking her. And so the king is beside himself. He is absolutely beside himself. And so he gives orders for Haman to be taken. And then as he's being taken, one of the servants speaks up and they go, hey, we saw that Haman built these gallows. And the king goes, you hang him on it. You hang him. Haman literally went home from the first dinner, built the gallows so he could hang on them the next day. The king says, that's perfect. He prepared gallows, let him swing. And that's exactly what they do. And on a day that began with Haman thinking he's about to hang Mordecai and then enjoy a nice dinner, he ends up swinging from the very gallows he had just built. I don't think there's a better example anywhere of poetic justice. It's not very often that a story ends with somebody hanging that everybody feels so good about. Not very often. But everything about how this plays out just feels right. However, this is more than just a feel-good story. There are lessons, there are principles for us in our lives and how we navigate and how we work in concert with the finger of God. You know, all throughout Esther's story, it feels like the bad guys are winning. It feels like it's all going the wrong way. And then in a moment, it flips. And it all flipped because Esther had courage, but not just courage. Esther had wisdom and discernment to know when, where, and how to make her move and accuse Haman and unveil the plot to the king. Esther was in a really good spot. God had set her up for success. He had given her this opportunity, but she could have blown this in so many different ways. I mean, I don't know the mysteries of the universe. I don't know what, I can't say with certainty what would have happened, but I would imagine that as she went to the king that very first day and he reaches out the scepter and she goes, "Great, I'm in." And she just barges in and goes, "Hey, Haman's trying to kill everybody and me, and you should hang him." I don't think that would have worked. That was neither the time nor the place nor the way for her to do that. She had the wisdom to know it might have looked like an open door, but that was not. God had another moment prepared down the line for her. And so she passes that one up. And even at dinner that night, same thing happens. It seems like everything's in the right place, but for some reason she goes, "This just isn't it." And she's got the wisdom and discernment to know, not now, and she waits. And if she had not have waited, the king would have never been up reading the book of Chronicles and memorable deeds. He would have never remembered Mordecai, and Haman wouldn't have went home and built his own gallows to hang on had she jumped the gun. I'm not saying that Esther has to be perfect for all this to work out, but a lot of times you and I, we overestimate our ability to make good things happen, and we underestimate our ability to ruin them. It's absolutely true that God providentially is orchestrating our lives for our good and for His purpose, but He doesn't mind control us. We have got to balance courage and wisdom in order to take advantage of God's providential work. God is going to put you in great spots. He's going to give you opportunities. He's going to set you up for success, to make a difference. But we have to properly seize them by not just being courageous, but by being wise and discerning as well. Esther probably would have not done so well had she just went in guns blazing without any sensitivity or thought of God's timing. But because she was not just courageous, but wise, it all worked out beautifully. And Jesus says to us in Matthew 10, He says, "Behold, I am sending you as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." Esther didn't do anything underhanded. She did nothing underneath the table, and yet she found a way to perfectly set and spring a trap for a wicked and evil man who was plotting the destruction of her and her entire people. But she did not get ahead of God, and she sought God to try and work in concert with Him throughout that. Esther waited faithfully, and then she acted wisely. And if you and I want to be effective like she was effective, we have to use that same blueprint. We are called to do just exactly what she did. Not just courage, but wisdom. But I will say to you, don't allow the fear of getting something wrong to freeze you into doing nothing. Be courageous and be wise, but God is asking for you to be courageous and be wise, not to be perfect. And so when you see opportunities, be courageous and be wise, but seize them. Do not step away from them because you're afraid of maybe making a misstep. Seize them, consulting God and with wisdom. But this story also teaches us one other very important insight about how the finger of God works and guides not just us, but how it works in the lives of the arrogant and the evil and the wicked people. Because we can clearly see that in the life of Haman, just as much as God set Esther up for success, He also set Haman up at the same time. And He does that not just with Haman, but throughout Scripture we see that He's going to do that with a lot of wicked and arrogant and prideful people. And that's good news for us, because I don't know about you, but it feels like when I look around, I oftentimes see a lot of people like Haman doing well. And that can be discouraging, and it can be frustrating, and it can make you feel hopeless. Because at the same time you're wondering where God is and why He's not doing what you want Him to do in your life, you look around and you say, well, you're not doing anything for me, and yet that evil, wicked guy is just having everything go his way. Are you not going to do anything about that? We're not the first people to struggle with that. Psalm chapter 73, the psalmist writes this. He says, "For I was envious of the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked." I was envious of the arrogant because the wicked are prospering. Everything's going their way. But then later down in Psalm 73, we read this. The same guy, a few verses down, says, "Truly, you, God, set them, the wicked and the arrogant, in slippery places. You make them fall to ruin. How they are destroyed in a moment, swept away utterly by terrors." God is setting the wicked people in slippery places. He's not just working for our good and for his purposes, but part of his purposes is the humbling of the wicked and the proud. 2 Samuel 22:28 says, you save a humble people, but your eyes are on the haughty to bring them down. And then famously in James says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. The finger of God works for his people to accomplish his purposes. But that also means that he works against the proud. He is not indifferent to them. God has not forgotten you. He has not left you to swing. He has not left you to hang on your own. He has not forgotten you. His finger is orchestrating and writing your story even when you can't see it. And he has also not forgotten the wicked and the arrogant. He has not forgotten those who do evil. Just as much as he is setting you up for success and to make a difference, he is setting them in slippery places. And the point of that is not so that we can hate those people and pray for their downfall and destruction. But the point is there is justice in this life or the next. There are some that may look like they're getting away with it and they keep on getting away with it, but one day they're going to have to stand before God and they're going to have to answer for what they've done. And God will deal justly with them. And so if you're discouraged because it seems like the evil and the arrogant are running rampant, everything's going their way, know with assurance God sees them. He has not forgotten them, and he will deal justly with them. But if you are struggling with the other side of it and you're thinking, well, I'm not sure what God's positioning me for, and I'm not really sure how to take advantage of this because, I want to be wise, but I don't know how, and you want a place to start, I would encourage you to start where Esther started and start today. We've got just a few minutes left. We're going to sing a song, and you can start now. Esther started by fasting and praying for 3 days. She sought God earnestly before she did anything. And so if you want to be somebody like Esther, if you want to seize the opportunities, if you want to be sensitive to God's timing and his movement, and you want to be wise, then I would encourage you to start now and seek God earnestly. Ask him to show you where he has positioned you, what opportunities are in front of you. Ask him to give you the courage to step forward and the wisdom to know how. And although you start now, I would encourage you to not just do this for the next 5 minutes, but to do this for the days, the weeks, the months, and years to come. But I would invite you to start now. So if you would, stand and sing, and let's go before God together.